Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 295. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Duke Ellington, Money Jungle, from 1963 on United Artists. It's a collaboration with Charles Mingus and Max Roach. This particular version is actually a Blue Note release, as you can see, from 1986. There was a remastering project at some point. Both Blue Note and United Artists had been bought by EMI, and Michael Koskuna, the producer who did so many reissues, was in charge of this reissue, so it's remastered with 4 additional tracks. The original recording, and I've never heard an original press of this, was apparently not very good. And I will say this remastering is still not the best sounding record. The piano in particular sounds like it was recorded in the 1930s, not the 1960s, but it's still listenable. This record is a meeting of 3 very different artists. Duke Ellington, the greatest jazz man of all, the Lord of the Swings, who by the early 1960s was now ready to start experimenting with some younger players. The drummer Max Roach, the bebop innovator who was very heavily involved in the civil rights movement at the time this record was made, and Charles Mingus, the unique and sometimes unstable compositional genius, like Roach, a fiery social critic, and someone who was a contemporary of the beboppers but always stood apart from them. Does it work? Kind of. Is it fascinating? Usually. Should you buy it? Maybe. In talking about the background for this record, it's probably appropriate to start with Duke, whose career stretched from World War I all the way to 1974. For long stretches of that period, his band was considered to be the best orchestrated band in the whole world of jazz, and he led them through a whole bunch of different evolving styles. He himself spawned the careers of many brilliant players, and he persevered in the face of what was basically cultural apartheid to become the dean of American popular music. While Duke's music was always progressing, I think it's fair to say that at heart he was always a swing artist, and so his career, the broader arc of it, rose and fell with the popularity of swing. By 1962, swing was basically yesterday's news, even if Duke was still enjoying a pretty lucrative career in the touring scene. But Duke had remained artistically alive, and in the early 60s, with nothing really to prove, he was open to a variety of new things like collaborations with his old rivals, but also collaborations with younger musicians who'd grown up listening to his music, but had also built their own careers, in some respects, rebelling against it. Now, this particular experiment has its origins in Paris. Duke and his great collaborator, the pianist Billy Strayhorn, loved Paris, and they had spent a lot of time there with their band in the 1950s. Ellington had had a gopher, a kid from Boston called Alan Douglas, who would run errands for the band on behalf of his record company. Douglas then continues in the record business throughout the 1950s, kind of hard to figure out exactly doing what, but in 1962 he pops up quite spectacularly for United Artists as their lead A&R man and producer on the Jazz imprint. Douglas would go on to have a remarkable career as a producer for both jazz and pop. He recorded Bill Evans, he recorded Chick Corea, a whole bunch of Jimi Hendrix, but one of the very first things that happens to him in this role is a reconnection with Ellington. But the historical record is a little bit uncertain as to how this record comes about. One version, which you can read in Downbeat, is that Ellington shows up in Douglas's office in 1962, says he wants to make a piano record, and Douglas then reaches out to Charles Mingus, who fleetingly at that time was signed to United Artists, and then Mingus in turn says, well, we should get Max Roach. But Douglas, in a later conversation with the New Yorker, said the piano record was actually his idea, that Ellington went away and thought about it for 6 months, and then got hold of Douglas and said, okay, but I want to make it with some younger musicians. At this point, Ellington was in his early 60s, and Mingus and Roach were both around 40 years of age. And it was a bit contentious because Mingus, of course, had played with Ellington in 1953, but very briefly he lasted 3 or 4 days, at which point he was kicked out for getting into a fistfight with Ellington's trombone player. As for Roach, he himself had no beef with either of the others, but it was still a little bit unusual to pair this bebop star with Ellington, who was, of course, the quintessential moldy fig. Having agreed to make the record, the 3 of them engaged in no rehearsals. They did meet in advance once to discuss what they were going to play. At that meeting, Roach and Mingus were suitably fanboying Ellington. Ellington, for his part, was suitably humble, saying, let's share the wealth in terms of the compositions. We can't just play my tunes. But of course, in the end, that's exactly what they did. This record is made in New York on September 17th, 1962, the day after the musicians had met as a threesome for the very first time, and it's recorded at Soundmaker Studio on 57th. The producer is Alan Douglas. As I mentioned, the producer of the 1986 remix is Michael Koskuna. Ellington is on piano, Mingus is on bass, and Roach is on drums. And notwithstanding the earlier conversation, Ellington, ever the band leader, had showed up early for the session with charts for all the tracks they could record. He had also done drawings to illustrate the theme of the music. So, for instance, for the track Money Jungle, he had drawn pictures of snakes and pictures of people ripping off musicians and basically said to Roach and Mingus, play this. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given how ad hoc the planning was, the sessions were, by all accounts, extremely bad-tempered. Arguably, any session in the 1960s featuring Mingus might have been prone to a little volatility, but even if Charles was feeling fairly stable that day, he probably was well within his rights to feel peeved at Ellington basically using his status to monopolize the writing credits. Mingus was also kind of annoyed with Roach's drum playing, which I gotta confess is a perspective that I have a little bit of sympathy for. And at one point he gets so pissed off he storms out of the studio and Ellington has to chase him and bring him back in to finish the rest of the numbers. All the tracks did end up getting recorded, plus a number of extras. Lots of emotion on this record, but certainly what comes through is not peace and happiness. There was to have been a second record featuring these three for United Artists, but none of the principals wanted to make it. But this did not put Ellington off his collaborations with younger musicians, because exactly 1 week after he makes this record, he goes into the studio for Impulse to make a record with John Coltrane. Side one starts with Money Jungle, and this is like nothing else I have in my collection. Nobody is comping on behalf of anybody else at any point. Ellington is playing his bluesy lines, but he's also playing some discordant pieces and sticking to his guns. Roach is not taking a backseat to anybody at any point. Mingus is playing like a man possessed. Is it fascinating? Absolutely. Is it good? I don't know. We then have a real change of pace on the second track, Fleurette Africaine, and in fact, in general in this record, there's a real change of mood and feel between the up-tempo numbers and the down-tempo ones in terms of the tension. Duke is playing these abstract, kind of angular but very gentle lines, and Mingus is superb in this track. He's just fluttering around. On the next track, Very Special, we're back into a world of tension. Ellington's playing basically a bluesy number. Mingus is largely cooperating with him. Roach, however, has this kind of suspended feel to his playing. He never settles into a groove, and to my ears, he never leaves any space for the more melodic instruments. Then another mood swing for Warm Valley, which is basically a ballad setting for Duke, who is unaccompanied through much of the track until Mingus comes in, and this is pretty straightforward. It's an Ellington standard. On this remastered version, we then have two tracks that were not available on the original pressing. REM Blues is a fairly straightforward blues, pretty well integrated as a group, but you wouldn't necessarily call the playing tight. The side closes with a little Max Parfait, which, as the name implies, is a Max Roach vehicle, and his playing is up front and high register all the way through. Side 2 starts with Wigwise, and this is one of the tracks where the combination of these players actually works pretty well, if only because I think both Mingus and Roach have moved towards and are supporting Duke in this. Switchblade is the third of the bonus tracks, and this is a 12-bar blues featuring excellent playing by Mingus. Then we have Caravan, which is a good, if somewhat jagged, treatment of a Duke standard, and this is an example where I think the three different styles largely work okay together. The fourth of the bonus tracks is next, and that's Backward Country Boy Blues, and this actually may be my favorite track in the record, particularly because the interplay between Ellington and Mingus is superb. And the record closes with Solitude, which is just lovely, and it's a good example of why Duke never liked to be pigeonholed as a jazz musician, because really, until Mingus and Roach come in about halfway through, this is effectively almost a classical solo piano piece. This record is often hailed as a masterpiece, but I think I'm going to swim a little bit upstream on that. There's often a little too much going on here. This is not in any way a group of musicians playing. They aren't particularly tight, and they are typically not leaving that much space for each other, particularly true, I will say, of Roach. In my opinion, he imposes himself here regularly to the detriment to the music. Ellington and Mingus are also jousting, but to me that has a more conversational feel. On the other hand, there is some fantastic playing on this record, particularly by Mingus, and there's something gripping about a record where you really have no idea what's going to happen next, and you can feel the energy and the tension coming out of the grooves. This is the antithesis of the paint-by-numbers blue note blowing session. So I guess what I'd say is every proper jazz collection probably needs to have this record, but its significance is as much historical as it is musical. For me, it's 4 to 5 stars.